Koliko su ljudima danas važne vijesti? Koliko ljudi danas misli da im vijesti uopće nisu važne? Po nekim istraživanjima, više od 50% Hrvata poručuje da aktivno izbjegava vijesti. Zašto je to tako? Pitat ćemo danas američku znanstvenicu koja se bavi upravo izbjegavanjem vijesti. Naša je gošća Ruth Palmer.
Many people don't actually know the difference between professional journalism and everything else online. The concern is that you're going to wind up with a population that is not informed about what powerful people are doing. News is basically an institutionalized warning system for society. Generation Z, I think that they have a lot of wonderful qualities, but we have failed them when it comes to media literacy.
Ovo su Ideje HR, ja sam Domagoj Nokmet. Na samom početku podsjećam vas, pretplatite se na naše YouTube i Spotify kanale, tako ćete nas pronaći najjednostavnije. Danas se bavimo vijestima, odnosno izbjegavanjem vijesti, trendom koji je vrlo prisutan u svijetu, toliko prisutan da je postao predmet znanstvenog istraživanja. Naša je gošća američka znanstvenica koja trenutno radi u Španjolskoj na EA University u Madridu, Ruth Palmer, ujedno i autorica knjige o izbjegavanju vijesti. Good afternoon, welcome to Zagreb.
Thank you for having me.
How would you define news avoidance today? What does it actually mean?
That's a great question. So academics study news avoidance a lot now. Over the last 10 years, it's become a very big area of study, and different academics define it differently. So this is confusing for everyone, and there's a lot of kind of infighting among academics over how we should actually be defining this. So on the one hand, there are people who say, you should be defining it based on whether people are doing something on purpose. Are they actively, avoidance sounds like an active thing. People are only avoiding news if you ask them and they say, yes, I'm actively trying to not consume news these days. And then on the other hand, you have people who say, no, you can still be avoiding news if you're simply not consuming it. So, the way that my co-authors and I try to get around this problem is we talk about two different kinds of news avoidance. So on the one hand, there are people who consume news, but if you ask them, they will say that they do actively, intentionally, sometimes or often try to avoid it. Okay, so in their case, it is a conscious, effortful behavior. On the other hand, there are people who simply end up consuming no news at all. Whether it's intentional or not, they are not consuming news, and we define those as consistent news avoiders. So these are two different categories, and it's important to keep in mind that there are differences. There are overlapping categories, but people who selectively avoid news often do still consume it. Okay, and in fact, sometimes they consume a lot of news. It may be, in fact, that you have to consume a certain amount of news to be able to consciously say, I am avoiding it now. That group of people is kind of concerning because there are a lot of them. And we can talk more about those numbers if you want. On the other hand, people who consistently avoid news, so people who are simply not consuming any news at all, these are people who, if you ask them how much news they're consuming, they'll say they have not consumed news in the last month. Okay, so they're really consuming very little news. The percentages of those people are smaller all around the world. Okay, so many people say they sometimes or often avoid news. Other people, very few people really, between about 3 and 10%, depending on the country, do not consume any news at all. That group, though, is more concerning because those are people who are more likely to really be uninformed about what is going on in their country and their community in the world.
Some of the reasons are personal or social in some specific way for some community, but there is a difference among states. Mm-hmm. So in European Union, at the top are Bulgaria and Croatia. Can we speculate why and why we should be worried about it?
Okay, so there are probably cultural factors that go into this that play a role, but really what I think we need to think about here is political context. So people associate news with politics for obvious reasons. Most people learn about politics through news. That is their main source of information about politics. And for many people in many countries, news and politics are sort of overlapping spheres. Okay, these are not easily separated. So we know that in countries where politics is perceived as corrupt and not kind of democratically robust, and at the same time where media is perceived as not independent from politics, right? So these are overlapping, and both of them are problematic because they're basically the same thing. News avoidance is higher.
But what about situation like in Croatia? At least we feel it like that, where journalists are targeted by politicians. Can that also be the reason for avoidance if supporters of those politicians start to believe that journalists are not objective, not professional?
Absolutely. So this is another factor as well. In places where you have a lot of very heated anti-media political rhetoric, this can also contribute to news avoidance. Okay, so this often happens in places where you have a highly polarized political system, but it can happen anywhere where you have political figures that are, often more populist, who are really targeting journalists, and they speak against them, and they make claims that they're not independent, or that they are biased, or that all the news they produce is fake news. These ideas really resonate with the public. And, we know that they resonate partly because when we interview people who do not consume any news at all, they still say that the news media is biased and you can't trust it and so forth. These are ideas that kind of percolate through the culture and people learn them. And political rhetoric contributes to that in a very big way.
Another also question, at least from my perspective, is that when people say we not consume news or we avoid news, actually that's not true, because very often in the second question you find out that they actually are informing themselves through the social media. Mm-hmm. So should we be afraid of the society where news will be replaced with AI fake news?
So you're absolutely right that when you ask people if they avoid news, often in these surveys we actually do define news for them. So we'll say by news we mean current events information on any platform, television, radio, etc.
But not social media.
Usually we don't stipulate necessarily social media. Mm-hmm. Often when people hear this question, though, they're not thinking about social media. They're thinking about sort of more traditional news sources, and so they'll say, yes, I do avoid that. Now, it's also true with these surveys that we think that some percentage of the public is doing what we call expressive responding. So they've decided they don't like the news media, and they're going to say that even though they do actually consume it. So that's one thing that happens. But it's certainly true that, when you talk to people a little bit more, sometimes the same person that has just said to you that they don't consume any news, it turns out that they're getting a lot of news from alternative sources. Maybe they follow conspiracy theorists on YouTube. Maybe they see news influencers on social media. And as it turns out, when you speak to them, they're actually quite informed. They might be informed, in what you feel is kind of a biased or even really absolutely incorrect way. But they are getting this information from somewhere. So to go back to your question, I do think we need to be concerned about what the sources are. Now, you can get good news on social media, quality news on social media, but you can also get a lot of terrible information that is not well sourced. So it depends a lot on where you're getting information. And one of the things that we know about people who consume most of their news through social media is that they often don't know where it came from. So if you ask them, about a piece of news they saw on social media, they'll say, well, I don't really know what the source was. They know they saw it on YouTube, or they know they saw it on X or TikTok. And I think that is problematic because it suggests that not only are they not verifying whether this is coming from a trustworthy source, they don't even know what the source is.
How dangerous can it be for society and for individual citizens if we all wake up in news avoidance world?
Again, it depends on the quality of the news that's available. Okay,
but let's dream.
Let's assume that the quality of the news is very good. It's a problem. So one of the things we've seen over the last 10 years or so is a documented increase in the number of people who selectively avoid the news. So these are the people who say that they sometimes or often avoid news, and also a slow increase that's less well studied in people who are not consuming any news at all. Okay, why is this a problem? Well, the concern is that you're going to wind up with a population that is not informed about what powerful people are doing. That's the most important reason, right? So, whether it's politicians, whether it's business leaders, it's very important for the public in a democracy to be aware of what powerful people are doing. And the best source of information about that, if the news media is independent and operating well, is the news media. So if people are not consuming that information, then they're not monitoring effectively what powerful people are doing. And we know that that simply leads to kind of snowballing corruption. So that would be alarming.
Also, you said today on this conference, it is also the problem because those people are not capable of advocating for their own rights.
That's absolutely right. So one of the concerns about news avoidance is that some groups avoid news more than other groups. So this is absolutely true of young people who consistently avoid news more than others. So they simply do not consume it more than older generations. Women tend to avoid news selectively and consistently more than men. People of lower socioeconomic backgrounds, although that gets a little bit complicated, and I can talk more about it if you want, people with low interest in politics tend to avoid news more. And so one of the concerns is that if those groups of people are the ones who are avoiding news more, they're going to be the ones who are less capable than other people of advocating for their needs. Because it's through news, ideally, that we find out about what policies are, what politicians are working for us, which ones are pushing policies that are actually in our best interest. And so if people are tuned out of news, then the concern is that they simply can't pressure politicians, right? Politicians aren't aware that they're paying attention because they're not. So that's a serious concern.
Do you think that we already know, at least theoretically, how can we fight that problem?
I think it's a very, very complicated problem, actually, news avoidance in general, because there are these different layers to it. So I'll start with the most difficult one to combat, and then we can get to the things that I think that are easier to address. On a sort of macro level, there are technological changes that have contributed to news avoidance that are very difficult to roll back. So there are more options for people than there have ever been before because of digital media. So we know based on work, most famously by a political scientist named Marcus Pryor, who works at Princeton, that before digital media, a lot of people probably ended up consuming news who were not particularly interested in it. So there weren't a lot of other options. So you turn on the TV, well, the news was pretty much the only thing that was on at that time, right? There wasn't a whole lot to do, when it came time to, when people wanted to do something for leisure. Well, maybe they would look at the newspaper. But as options have increased with digitalization, what's happening now is that many people who were never particularly interested in news before aren't consuming it, right? Moreover, especially among young people, but increasingly among older generations as well, when people want specific information, they now have what appear to them to be more efficient ways to get it. So they can Google it, basically. There's no reason to turn to news if you want information about something that pertains to you right away.
And they're not aware of the risk of algorithm picking for them something what is maybe not the best answer.
I think some are and some people are and some people aren't aware of that. In some cases, people want that. What they want is a personalized answer, right? And so they see this as an advantage, right? So on the one hand, you have people who think, well, if I want information, I can just find it easily myself. On the other hand, you have people who, or often these are the same people, who say, well, if it's something really big that happens in the world, I'll find out about it. The news finds me. This is a phenomenon that's been studied quite a lot on social media. It will simply appear. So, for example, you could talk to anyone here in Zagreb who does not consume any news at all. And if you say to them, well, what's going to happen if there's a terrorist attack in the next town over or in some other part of Zagreb? They will say, well, I'll find out about that. So the big news will find people. So these become kind of excuses for people or reasons that people give for not consuming news more directly. This is something that's very difficult to address because this has to do with broad technological changes that actually have very little to do with the news that's being provided. Okay, so that's one issue. Another set of issues have to do with, frankly, how we're raised and how we're socialized around news. So people who are raised in families where news is considered important are more likely to consume news when they're older, right? So it's important to teach young people that news consumption is important. So that's one thing that can be addressed. But we also know that adults are more likely to consume news consistently if they're surrounded by other people who also consume news and expect them to, right? So there's a kind of social pressure that goes on. People who do not consume news usually do not belong to these groups. So, another way that we can potentially intervene here is for news organizations and countries, frankly, to try to increase awareness about the social benefits of keeping up with the news. It's embarrassing to not know about what's happening in the news to a lot of people, and it's important to kind of try to play this up. But in a way, the easiest ways to try to intervene in this very complicated problem are to try to address some of the ways that individuals say they are the reasons why they avoid news. So one of these is that people consistently say that the news is too negative. It has a negative effect on their well-being and their mental health.
Do you believe personally that this is a reason?
So it's complicated because, one of the things we also know is that if you look at analytics that most of us don't see, but that news organizations really are focused on very much, right? If they know who is clicking on what and how long they stay on that story. People actually click on the negative news, right? And there's evidence from before that people buy more magazines with negative stories on the cover, right? So behavioral data seems to suggest that people actually like negative news. If you ask them, they always say that they don't. Okay, so what is happening here? I think that in a short-term way, people do respond to it. That does not mean that they like it. And little by little, I think it does negatively affect people's moods, and they know it. And increasingly, just in our culture, there's a lot of emphasis on well-being and health and mental health, and people are aware of this. And so partly, yes, they're just saying that, but I think also there is something to it. I mean, this is just study after study, people talk about this. So I think we need to pay attention to it.
But if we live in society which has a lot of problems, and if we start to avoid as journalists negative topics or problems, what will be our purpose?
That's true. Okay, so this is why this is actually such a complicated thing, right? It's not easy to just make news happy, and it's not easy because news is basically an institutionalized warning system for society, right? We all have a negativity bias. This is something that psychologists have studied extensively, meaning that we pay more attention to negative things. And this has evolved. This is evolutionary. It's because we need to survive. And in order to survive, we need to pay attention to threats. So you can think about news in a way as I said, an institutionalized collective effort to warn ourselves about things that we need to know about. This is why we have so much news about catastrophes and weather events that are dangerous, conflicts, right? So there's a reason why news is so negative. And I don't think anybody really wants that warning system to be totally reversed so that we're only talking about wonderful things, because then we won't know about these threats, right? So then the question is, how do you address this perception that news is too negative without changing completely what news is for, right? And there are some interesting efforts to do this. So, for example, there's the constructive journalism movement here in Europe, and in the United States and in North America, it's often referred to more as the solutions journalism movement. These are overlapping categories. They're really very similar. The goal is to try to retain the seriousness of news, retain the mandate to cover socially important issues, but to try to cover not only problems, but also potential solutions to these problems. So that's one approach where, you're not covering completely different things, but you are covering them differently, okay? Another approach is to try to just include a greater percentage of happier stories. So when you speak to many people, there is a widespread perception or belief that the news never covers anything that's happy. Now, that's not true.
From practice, we can tell you that unfortunately, something what can be basically called happy news is always we have figures. There is a less of interest of that same audience for those stories at the end.
Yeah, see, this is the problem: is that people say that they don't like it, but in practice, it seems like they do, right? So this is difficult. Well, part of what might be happening here is that we're talking about different groups of people. So, it could be that people like your audience, for example, like people who are very engaged with current events, public affairs, these kinds of topics. It may be that they are. It's not so much that they're less bothered by the negativity of news, but rather they have other reasons to engage even though it's disturbing, right? So they may find these stories upsetting, but there's a counter narrative that they have learned, which is that it's important. So it may be upsetting, but it's important. On the other hand, I think one of the things that we find in our work with consistent news avoiders is that this idea that they have a civic duty to consume news, that it's really important, they don't tend to have that counter narrative. So if you don't have that, then what are you left with is just a feeling that news is negative and you can't do anything to change it.
One non-scientist question. During your work, when you approach to somebody who is news avoider, he's probably not aware, or he doesn't think of himself as a news avoider. And when he understands that he is in your scientific focus, does it bring him to some kind of reaction, self-inspection or something like that? Do you have this experience that people become aware that, okay, I'm a news avoider, what does it mean for me?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. So when I first started doing this work, one of my concerns, and the concern of my colleagues as well, was that, maybe people won't be honest about this. That, we've all learned that we should be consuming news, so maybe people will feel bad about not consuming news, or won't even admit it. But I've been sort of surprised to find how often people do seem to be quite honest, that they don't consume any news at all. They are honest about their lack of interest. Some people do feel bad about it. And they'll say, I feel like I should be more informed, and then they give you reasons why they don't consume news. So in some cases, I have had people say, I feel bad. Because you're calling their attention to some of these behaviors. And of course, I always say, no, I'm not here to judge you, because I'm not. But in some cases, you can tell that people on some level have learned the civic duty kind of narrative, that they should be more informed, and they feel a little bit bad that they're not.
You said there's several levels of the problem. So you have this technological macro level, then you have this social, and then individual reasons. Do you agree with me that one of the maybe most influential approaches is education? To educate people to understand technology, to understand that technology of social media can be dangerous for them, to educate them on the level that you will explain them that they have to be informed if they want to fight for their own rights.
Yes, in a word, yes, I agree with you. I think that it's important to not put all of the blame for a lot of these things on individual audiences. So, there are problems with news.
I'm targeting states right now.
Right. No, so, there are problems with news and things, but absolutely, I think that collectively we need to look at education and think about media literacy. This is an area, it's very easy to say that, but let's talk about it a little bit. Why is this hard? It's hard, it's not easy. And, I think that we are living in a moment when we can see very clearly that over the last 10 years or so, let's just take that block of time, we have not done it very well. Almost anywhere in the world, really. Why is that? Well, media has changed radically in that time. And, as I'm a professor, it is very difficult for me to keep up to date with what's going on in order to prepare my university level students who are studying communication and digital media to filter through all of the stuff that they are seeing and to identify, even in a very basic way, what they should trust. So if you think about media literacy really should start at the grade school level when, with children. How long does it take to update curriculum? It takes some time. It takes time. This is a collective effort at the state level, as you say, and we need to figure out how to start teaching children how to be more discerning about what they're seeing online. Okay, and there are a number of different things that can be addressed. I mean, one is very basically, how do you discern what's true and what's false? This is very difficult. Okay, it is not easy, and it is not an easy thing to teach. It's particularly difficult when we're talking about news, because it starts very quickly to get into questions about bias, right? The easiest thing to do would be for a teacher to be able to say, you should trust this medium. This is the source you should trust. Well, that's very difficult for teachers to do, particularly risky in polarized environments, because they simply can't do that, right? So how do you teach a child that they should trust this over that? I think right now we're seeing the negative effects of our having done this badly. What do we have? We have a Generation Z that is wonderful in many ways, okay? Let me just say that I teach Generation Z. I think that they have a lot of wonderful qualities, but we have failed them when it comes to media literacy, in the sense that they know that they are supposed to be critical of media and they are not supposed to trust it. The problem is they don't know what to trust. So, I speak, and right now I'm doing a study of young people, young news consumers and avoiders in Spain, and one of the things that they are telling me is they prefer to consume news on social media because they feel like they have more control there. They feel that they are at least seeing different sources. And if they just go to one source, there's the possibility that it will be biased. And they don't know one source that they can trust. And so they feel like they're seeing a lot of different sources, and they have learned that they're supposed to be comparing different sources. Okay? But and that's true in a lot of ways, but the problem is if you're doing that on social media, as I said before, they often don't know what the sources are for any of these. They're just seeing, secondly, much of what they're seeing is just commentary about news. It's not actually news from, professional sources that have sought out, investigated, and verified the material.
And I think that we can witness that algorithms are actually preferring biased materials.
Yeah, this is one of the problems that I think, again, this is something that young people, everybody should be taught. And I think people, to various degrees, know it or don't. Okay, there's a big variety in the population of how educated people are about this. But certainly, social media platforms make money when people stay engaged with that social media platform for a longer period of time. How do they get people to do that? Often by showing them material that makes them feel emotionally ignited, right? Often it's material that is extreme. It's material that's likely negative, or like either that agrees with them already, so they're enthusiastic about that, or that they don't agree with. That's also very provocative. So this kind of rage baiting is very, very effective for platforms that want to keep people engaged. So this is something that, again, this should be part of media literacy. People should understand that that's why they're being shown certain things.
My first suggestion was education. My second suggestion, which I would like to test with you, is regulation. European Union is an empire of regulations. We believe that we can make things better if we regulate them, comparing to other parts of the world which have a different approach. Do you think that social media can be regulated?
Yes, I think it can. I think this is a very complicated area. I think the EU is sort of the leader in this, and look at how much trouble they're having. Yeah. Yes, I do believe that social media can be regulated. I am not an expert in that area, but one area that's important is, money for news. So one of the problems that we're seeing now is that, I've mentioned that, people complain that news is too negative, that they complain that news is too influenced by commercial interests or by political interests. The best way to buffer news providers from any of these influences is by making sure that they have enough money to operate independently. This is something that regulation can contribute to, by redirecting, money to news organizations and things like this. But it's complicated because, that process in itself can appear to be politically sort of biased or, a form of influence on news media. But that's, one of the most important ways that regulation could, play a role here is by ensuring that news organizations have enough money to operate without having to be so dependent, for example, on advertising or so beholden to political interests.
My third suggestion considers media itself. I think that media, we have to redefine ourselves, maybe even to reinvent ourselves, because now everything is media. And when you talk about young people who do not believe to media, the question is, what is the media? A lot of those outlets I don't like to consider colleagues, for example. So what media can or have to do?
Well, I think that one thing that's very important is, for many people, many people don't actually know the difference between professional journalism and everything else online. Commentary, for example. What's the difference between a professional journalist and someone who's simply commenting on news? I think a lot of young people they detect that there's a difference there, but they haven't really been taught what the difference is. So I think that professional journalists, it is important for them to have a clear demarcation between what they do and what all these other people do, and to try to educate the public about what that is. So in my view, you're a professional journalist, you are better able to say than I am in a lot of ways, but it's a matter of independence, right? So not being influenced by, commercial pressures or political pressures. It's a matter of doing original reporting. So actually going out and getting information and not just talking about information other people have collected. It's about verifying information to make sure that it is accurate. And it's about accepting responsibility when errors are made, and being transparent with the audience about all of those processes and when mistakes happen, because mistakes do happen. And, I think it erodes trust when people make mistakes, everybody sees it, and responsibility is not taken. So I think that, first of all, the first thing that professional news organizations can do is be professional. I know that in different contexts, this is very difficult, especially when, there is a lot of political pressure. It depends on the national context how protected news organizations are from that, but those are fundamentally things that they need to do. Here in Croatia, there is a perception, as we learned at the conference that you and I both attended, that journalism is not professional. And this is a country with extremely high levels of news avoidance. So, on the one hand, yes, if you have political figures who are continually saying that news is not professional, that does affect people's perception. But news also actually has to be professional, and adhere to these standards. And if it's not doing that, then, people are going to know. I think one of the things that's really important when we're trying to address these issues, just as an aside, is to not assume that the general public is stupid, right? And I think that it can be tempting to do that, to just be like, well, they only want to look at pictures of puppies or something like that. Yes, to a certain extent that might be true, that some people just want to look at pictures of puppies. But why do they want to look at pictures of puppies? Maybe we should try to understand from their perspective what their lives are like and the role that news actually plays in them, right? So, going back to your original point, I think that, professionalism is one thing that news organizations can do. I think also there are ways that they can make adjustments to or innovate regarding other aspects of news that people continually say that they don't like. So we talked a little bit about the negativity issue. People also often say that it's hard for them to tell how political news affects them. One of the main things that people avoid when you look at what are the topics people are avoiding, and this is true here in Croatia, they don't like the politics part. They have negative ideas about what politics is, and they don't feel it's relevant to them. Well, if your idea about what politics is that it's mostly politicians fighting amongst themselves or taking money when they shouldn't and doing other corrupt things, then of course that doesn't feel, it may affect you in the sense that you feel like they're not working for you when they should, but it doesn't feel like the news coverage of that directly affects your life. So I think that it's important for news coverage of the political arena to make more clear to people how what's going on in politics can affect them. What is the link between what these politicians are talking about on any given day in Parliament or Congress or wherever you are and your life? And if that's not clear to people, then no wonder they're tuning out. So, I think that making that connection more explicit to people is really important.
And without this connection, we have even bigger problem. It is involvement, avoidance into the politics. We have quite lousy results considering voting in Croatia. So I think that it is maybe a symptom of even bigger problem for society, for any society.
Yeah, one of the related issues, the larger trends here that news avoidance is certainly a part of, is a growing distrust in all institutions. So we find this in many countries. This is absolutely true in Croatia. Distrust of simply many institutions. So on the one hand, you have fairly high levels of trust of doctors and of firemen, for example. But then major institutions that in the past were more highly trusted simply aren't. So this is true of the political injustice system here, and also of journalists. And when people are not trusting of institutions, they're probably not going to be particularly trusting. Well, it's complicated, but if news is the main way people find out about these institutions that they don't trust, it's very confusing for people to say that they trust news if news is mostly about these untrustworthy institutions like the political arena, right? So, again, one of the reasons news avoidance is concerning is that there's a link between consuming news and engaging politically, right? So if you have more people that are not engaging with news, chances are you're also going to see a decline in political engagement. And it's a little hard to know which of these comes first, but they go together.
But they go together. You said me before this interview that we are living in grim times. And really, it's very difficult to point any society in the world, in the developed world, where you can see, okay, they don't have these problems with populism, fake news, and so on. What do you think we should expect in next 10 years?
Well, I would like to believe that we're at a particularly low point, and the reason, and meaning that things are going to get better regarding some of these things that I've talked about. And the reason why I'm hopeful about that is because I teach university students. And I teach them communication and digital media. So the people that I'm exposed to, the young people I'm exposed to, it's true. It's a special group in the sense that they're interested in these issues. But I've been pleasantly surprised over the last 15 years that I've been teaching in how, among the people I teach, there is a growing realization that these are problems. They are more concerned about the amount of time they spend on social media and on their phones than they have been in the time that I've been teaching. Over the last, even like 5 years ago, I didn't see this level of concern. There's a growing level of concern about, for example, trying to figure out what's true and what's not online. They realize that this is a problem. So, I'm kind of hopeful that there's going to be a growing realization that we're not going to be the only people that know that these are problems. Not that we are now, but there will be a growing recognition that some of this stuff really, really needs to be addressed. And, hopefully at the state level, education will get better. But it's true that, the way things are going right now, it's difficult to see a very clear path. And I think that part of it's because, money that used to go to journalism now goes to platforms. And regulation is slow. So turning that ship around is going to take some time. And I wish I could see the future and promise that it would be bright, but I think that what we're seeing are, a mix of signals. I personally, in my life with my students, feel that there is hope because they seem to be more aware of these issues than, young people were even a few years ago. But on the other hand, some of these larger forces seem to be kind of too big for most of us to handle.
Let's hope that this spark you see among your students will be the new path. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. It was great.
Hvala i vama, dragi gledatelji, hvala i vama, dragi slušatelji koji nas pratite putem radio stanica. Bile su ovo Ideje HR.